University of Galway. She is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, previously having served as President of the Council of Europe's Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking, GRETA. She is a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and was a Commissioner on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. She is also a member of this august institution, a member of the Royal Irish Academy. She has also supervised Andrew in the completion of his doctoral research, so possibly she is to blame. Would you please welcome up on stage Professor Siobhan Mullally.
Good evening, everyone, distinguished guests. Thank you all for joining this evening. It's really a great pleasure and a great privilege to be here to introduce this evening's event to mark the launch of Andrew's book. I had the privilege and honour to supervise Andrew in the latter stages of his doctoral research. In the early stages, Andrew was supervised by our colleague, Dr. Kathleen Kavanagh. And I really can't really say enough about how much I enjoyed and learned from this experience of supervision, from reading Andrew's work and from engaging with him from the time of his doctoral research. You're all very welcome this evening. Delighted to see colleagues here from the Irish Centre for Human Rights and others who've travelled to be here this evening. Andrew's book is critically important and very timely. European Human Rights Grey Zones, the Council of Europe and Areas of Conflict, published by Cambridge University Press. And the book builds on and develops from the doctoral thesis that was completed at the Irish Centre for Human Rights. And when Andrew submitted his doctoral thesis first in November 2020, we couldn't have imagined how urgent and timely the issues addressed would become for the Council of Europe, for our system of multilateralism, for peace, democracy and human rights protection. Less than 18 months later, the Committee of Ministers, reaffirming that the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine constituted a serious violation of the Statute of the Council of Europe, took the decision under Article 8 of the Statute to cease Russia's membership of the Council of Europe as from 16th of March 2022, the first time that this had happened. This year, 2024, marks the 75th anniversary of the Council of Europe, and we have just marked 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At a time when the declarations of human rights as common standards of achievement of all peoples and all nations seem particularly hollow, and the potential of international law to curtail the worst excesses of arbitrary force or to reinforce even the core principle of humanity as a foundational principle of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, seem elusive. I wrote those reflections this morning before looking at the news and seeing the news in particular from the International Criminal Court around the issuing of arrest warrants. And I think there we see, in the face of mass atrocity, we see a hope for justice, an appeal to justice, an appeal to our international justice institutions, and to the potential of international law. Andrew's book represents a call to action to member states of the Council of Europe and to the organisation and its constituent parts, returning us to the promise not only of the European Convention on Human Rights, but significantly also to the Statute of the Council of Europe, reminding us repeatedly of its object and purpose. At a foundational moment in Europe, when, to quote Hannah Arendt, millions of people displaced by war were seeking a better place in the world. The memory of unimaginable atrocities, while also faced with the banality of evil, informed the establishment of the Council of Europe, located in the city of Strasbourg, as a marker of both the potential and fragility of peace and solidarity across borders, much needed also today. This book is a sophisticated jurisprudential analysis of the Statute of the Council of Europe and of the European Convention on Human Rights system. It is deeply contextual, situated within a foundational and a recent history of conflict. It is informed by Andrew's extensive professional and political experience at the heart of the Council of Europe, and his earlier professional experience in post-conflict Kosovo, experiencing firsthand the complexities of transition to a just peace and democracy. And this experience, this professional experience, this practice experience, this experience at the heart of a politics of transition to peace and democracy, shapes the analysis and the breadth of this text. Most writing that we see on the European Convention on Human Rights system focuses on the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, the execution of judgments, the role of the Committee of Ministers, and the important processes of court reform to strengthen access to justice, which is a core theme of this book, strengthening the effectiveness of the system of human rights protection. What is unique, however, and what is, I think, a singular contribution of this text, and why I think it was literally snapped up by Cambridge University Press, is that it recognises and analyses the wider human rights protection system and potential of the Council of Europe. It is clear that Andrew's positioning and experience at the very heart of the Council of Europe gave him a vantage point through which the potential of monitoring bodies, of the good offices and normative will of the Secretary General and of the Committee of Ministers, and the role of the Court, as well as the collective and shared responsibility of states, are all viewed and recognised as being critical to the mission of the Council of Europe. Andrew proposes in the book a new approach to assess how the European Convention on Human Rights and Council of Europe system as a whole can better serve the millions of people now located in so-called grey zones, where significant protection gaps arise, and there is limited access to the justice promised by Europe's post-World War II human rights architecture. Recognising and reflecting on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 75 last year, we recalled the urgency of engaging all parts of the UN human rights ecosystem, linking the universal promise of the Universal Declaration itself, UN special procedures, treaty bodies, and the Human Rights Council. In Europe, we have the possibility and promise of a vastly expanded regional system of human rights protection, a right of individual petition, and the potential of interstate complaints that seek not only to ensure access to justice to all those subject to the jurisdiction of Council of Europe member states, but also to ensure accountability of states, recalling ultimately the imperative of state responsibility. Françoise Tulkens, former judge of the European Court of Human Rights, the external examiner of Andrew's doctoral thesis, in her foreword to the book, she notes that Andrew argues that grey zones within the territory of the Council of Europe give rise to a collective public order imperative on member states to seek maximal effectiveness of the Council of Europe human rights system. And she fully agrees with Andrew's call to action. Andrew calls for and presents a coherent legal argument rooted in the Statute of the Council of Europe for a judicious rapprochement with affected regions, premised on the collective responsibility of member states and the normative will of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. He presents an in-depth case study drawing on interviews with key stakeholders, seeking to understand what we can learn from the Kosovo experience, where Andrew spent many years. And although Andrew recognises that the sui generis status of Kosovo, including the underpinning legal framework of the Security Council Resolution 1244, he nonetheless presents potential lessons that can inform engagement with human rights grey zones to ensure that they do not become, for those within them, black holes of human rights protection, holes of oblivion. As Arendt said, do not exist, nothing human is that perfect, and there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. Calling for a fourth summit, which ultimately did take place, Andrew commented on the politics of human rights, noting that effectiveness has been a watchword in the Council of Europe for decades. Successive Secretary Generals have spoken about various reform processes focusing on structural, administrative or budgetary reforms. However, achieving effectiveness is not only an administrative process, it is in fact principally a political one. Nowhere in the Council of Europe should be without full and effective access to the human rights protection architecture. This book is animated by and informed by a return to the very object and purpose of the Statute of the Council of Europe. It addresses in depth the effectiveness of the European Convention of Human Rights system. It calls for and recognises the potential of law underpinned by human rights commitments and of political courage, which I think is something that Andrew brings to his work. The essence of totalitarian government, we know, and perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries mere cogs in the administrative machinery, and thus to dehumanize them. And Andrew's work, I think, seeks to challenge that, the so-called rule of nobody. He wrote also on the Reykjavik Declaration, calling it a summer of fire and ice, and I think we all know that Andrew wants and wanted it to be a summit of fire. He criticised it somewhat, noting that there's something in the declaration, the Reykjavik Declaration, something in it for everyone. Others have commented that there's not necessarily enough focus on the how to secure reform. But this is something that is very much at the heart of Andrew's book. He points to concrete processes of reform that can take place, and we were privileged with Andrew to host a major conference in Galway in September, I think 2022. The Galway principles that came out of that informed the work of the Forde Summit and are at the heart also of this book. To conclude, because I do feel your presence, I just want to note, in your presence, Chris, but I won't leave this out. I want to reflect on Andrew's deep commitment to engage research, to the role of the public intellectual, placing research at the service of public debate, democratic reform, and ultimately a key imperative for this book, the pursuit of peace and the effectiveness of human rights protection. The book is dedicated to Kushla, Saoirse, Donica, and Misha. And I want to thank you also for your support, for accompanying this research, the work along the way, and the publication, and for the many sacrifices I'm sure that you also made to bring this book to publication.